Well, I think we're going to just dive right in with the first question. This is more of a general question for everyone on the panel. But this gentleman asks, the theme of this conference is a focus on the basics. If you had to distill down what you believe the basics of pastoral ministry are, what would that include? Just start with anyone and feel free to chime in as you're led.
Well, I'll go. I just always say the same thing, so I'll get it said and then keep moving. That is, I think if we go to the pastoral epistles and you take all the things that Paul says to Timothy about the importance of understanding the doctrine, guarding the good deposit, and trusting the same to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. When you realize that from a human perspective, as Guthrie, the New Testament scholar, said, that Christianity trembled on the brink, from a human perspective, Christianity trembled on the brink of extinction as it moved from the apostolic to the post-apostolic era. And you realize how concerned Paul is. I charge you in the presence of God. I charge you in light of the fact that I'm going away. And then he says to him, eventually, there's all kinds of chaos going on at the beginning of chapter 4. But you keep your head, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, discharge all the duties of your ministry. And I think that you can probably break the rest of the pastorals out underneath those 4 headings with a little bit of work. But that's the way I approach just about every day. I mean, I think, well, here's another day of God's favor. What should I do today? Well, 1, keep your head. Don't let it get so fat you can't sleep. Don't let it get so pinhead that you're so discouraged that you're neutralized. Endure hardship. Wear the right glasses. Do the work of an evangelist. Be engaged in the gospel. Tell people about Jesus, publicly, privately, interpersonally. And then just do what you're supposed to do. Discharge all the duties of your ministry.
I'm so indebted in many ways to Mark Dever. He's just been one of 2 pastors who've had probably the most formative impact on my life, and he has a little quip to summarize the basics. Teach and pray, love and stay. Teach the people, pray down heaven on the people, love the people, and stay with the people. I'm sort of resonant with your talk yesterday. That the Lord does more in 20 years than He does in 5. And we normally get that backwards. And so, teach and pray, love and stay.
Just say the same thing in a slightly different way. I think of 4 sort of categories where the pastor has to be doing the basics well most of the time. Preaching, the fellow's got to be able to teach, and we have different gifts, but be faithful there and be growing in that. Second, he has to love, and I would add like at least most of his people. If you love your people, you like being with them, you go to some of their things and their open houses and the hospital, and you got to do those basics well most of the time. It's kind of paying the rent, to stay there. And then I would say third, and maybe this sounds not sacred enough, but I think a pastor has to be able to do the basics of administration or be aware enough of his weaknesses to get others to compensate for him. I mean, a lot of pastors they falter because they don't know how to do a meeting. They don't know, they don't show up when they say they are. They don't follow through on things. I don't think that's a weightier matter of the law, but in the way churches just work, you got to be able to do some of it or realize I'm bad at this and I'm going to get others around to help. And then the fourth thing is we need to attend to our own souls. We need to be growing in grace. We need to find ourselves happy and holy in Jesus. And that fourth thing, if that's not happening, then all of the rest will, you can build up a big monument to yourself, but the soul of it will shrivel.
It's good.
It's good, that's helpful. The second question has to do with sort of one of the sub-themes, it seems, in the addresses has been false teaching, false teachers, guarding the flock from dangerous doctrine. So this person asks, when is it or is it ever appropriate to highlight by name specific individuals in their ministries to help your congregation identify false and unbiblical teaching, and how do you do this graciously?
Well, I'll jump in first, so then they can clean up and get the wisdom afterward. But, well, I think which one of you pointed out that, Paul does it both ways. Sometimes he's Hymenaeus and Alexander, and other times it's some false apostles. So I think there's reasons where you would both obscure the individual and you would name the individual. And my sort of initial question to get at that is, if I'm mentioning this, does my congregation need to be warned mostly of the errant idea that's present, or mostly of the errant teacher? And so it may just be kind of a general idea that's out there, that's prevalent, and to put a name to it is just, oh, no, they're curious. What is it? I haven't heard of this person. But if it's a particular teacher that has inroads with your flock, or they're constantly running into people who are wondering, how do I make sense of this particular teacher, then I think we ought to name them. The pastor ought to be very wary of just always looking for a dogfight, just every Sunday, who's pastor going to get at this time? This is going to be the smackdown. And yet we shouldn't be so fearful that at times we have to say, here's who I'm talking about, and this person is teaching what is false and what is destructive, and you need to be on your guard. And then second, I would just think, in naming this person, do we mean to suggest that by and large this person's ministry is unfaithful and unfruitful? If it is, then that's the impression that people are going to take. But if we're, we think 10 of the books he's done are really good, and this last one just doesn't seem to be quite there, you wouldn't want to unnecessarily just have people, oh no, I really liked that book 3 books ago, and now I just feel so ashamed. So it takes a lot of care and wisdom to think through.
Yeah, I would concur with all of that. I think one of the questions I ask myself is, what is my motivation in doing what I'm about to do? Is it because I'm actually jealous of this guy, even though he is a bit of a heretic? And it allows me to vent my spleen a little bit and, stick it to him, although he doesn't care who I am or what I have to say. It doesn't really do very much at all. So I want to really second guess myself in doing that. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in that, and there's a kind of way of doing it that people, as you say, they begin to like that. And there are certain people who've made something of a career out of, being the protagonist and the antagonist, and to set things up so that it's done in that way. I was just at an event a few weeks ago where I was with a diverse group of people, and one of the people who was present at the event, I felt sure, I would have occasion to disagree with pretty quickly. And I'm glad that I had never ever said anything publicly about this person, because the thoughts that I had about them were unjustified in terms of what I found when I met them and what they actually said in person. And if I had chosen to volunteer my thoughts on this person, 1, I would have been wrong, 2, I would have harmed them, and 3, I would have harmed other people who were engaged with it. So I think just the question of motive and then the questions of concern that you've raised are combined in that.
And just 2 examples come to mind. One, slightly different than your question, but I remember one time in a prayer where a church was located, we had not a Mormon temple, but a gathering place or church or whatever they call it right next door. And so in my prayer, I prayed very strongly against the false teachings of Mormonism, the darkness of Mormonism, in very stark language, which I stand by absolutely. But I thought afterward, and I had somebody who was very upset because she was visiting and she finally got her husband to come to church, who was a Mormon, and he was very put off by this. And I didn't regret saying that, but what I thought was unwise, if I was going to say something that could land on people, seem very hard, I ought not to have done it in the context of a prayer like that, but in the message where it came out, and I could add the appropriate pastoral sort of, some of you may have this, you may have friends, you may have, and so the second example, I think, as I rack my brain, the only person that I've spoken of by name to criticize, I mean, probably others, but who are alive, I mean, would be Rob Bell when all of that was going out, and that was because we're in Michigan. He was pastoring a church in the town where I grew up. I'm pastoring a church in the town where he grew up. It's not an exaggeration to say every person in my church that I talked to knew somebody, had a friend, a relative, a grandma, somebody who went to Mars Hill. It was just everybody was talking about it. And so I felt like in the appropriate context it was necessary. And I tried to give, some of you may have been blessed by his ministry, or you may have seen this or that, and tried to give what I thought were the necessary cautions and corrections.
And I think that's good as well, because just listening to you, I mean, that you are responding to a circumstance that's out there, rather than you are introducing your people to something about which they knew nothing at all. And I think there's caution and grace in that, isn't there?
Yeah, not much to add to all the wisdom they've given. Just one of the things I appreciate about Alistair's first talk was he was exhorting us to make sure that our tone and our concern is arising from the scriptures appropriately. And so wherever you're going to name or discuss the issue, even if you do it without naming someone, I think it's important that we sort of feel, as it were, what the scripture is calling us to feel about persons and about issues. And that we're seen to be gentle. That the servant of the Lord must not quarrel, must not be quarrelsome, even as we have this responsibility to guard the sheep and protect the sheep, and to, from time to time, point out persons or point out issues that we need to do in our context with pastoral concern.
And I'd say the sins we rebuke from the pulpit ought most often to be the sins of our own people and of our own hearts. If you build up a ministry and it's always, there's a lot of bad guys out there doing a lot of bad things, you just inevitably build up a kind of self-righteousness.
All right, so changing subjects a little bit. So for a young pastor who's going into his first lead pastor, senior pastor role, and is following a guy who's been in the ministry for years, very established church, what kind of advice would you give a younger guy going into that situation, maybe from your own experiences, perhaps even mistakes? What kind of counsel would you give him?
You're first this time, brother.
Okay, yes,
Yeah,
sir.
yeah.
Obey your elders.
Yeah.
That's a good question. If the Lord gives me life and gives me any wisdom, or maybe some of you guys will do it before I do it. It seems like right now all the publishing craze is on church planting. I think we need a book called Pastor Planting. You know, how it is we plant ourselves in the life of a congregation that existed before us, and do that well. A few things that come to mind, and these brothers can fill in with better wisdom. If you can, try and get yourself 3 to 4, 5, 6 months where you don't have any major teaching responsibility. And use that first 3 or 6 months to visit the people, get to know the people, observe everything you can about the life of the church. They may not be able to afford you that long, but however much time you can get to just observe, to see what the Lord has done before you got there. I think that's really important. It's going to be really important for giving rise to thanksgiving for the Lord's work in the lives of the people before you got there. We need to be mindful that the Lord will bury the worker and continue to work. And so we're not that indispensable to the Lord's work, and we need to be looking for evidences of grace in the lives of the people and giving thanks for that. I'd say spend in your applications, in your sermons, spend your first 2 to 4 years commending everything you can about the church before you start sort of casting vision and tweaking and adjusting and critiquing. Make sure you know that the people have been faithful with the light that they've had, and in private and in public, commend everything you can commend so that they would grow to know your appreciation for them. And if you do that, you'll be, in time, and prove yourself faithful, in time you will begin to earn their favor and earn their trust and to be able to lead them. Just having the title doesn't yet make you their pastor. And we need to recognize that. And there's a sense in which we have to earn that by being patient, by being gentle, by getting to know the people. The other things I think are already in people's minds. I would just say you probably, if this is your first pastorate, you're probably thinking about things like your preaching ministry and your teaching ministry. You want to get that right. You want to be faithful at that. And there's probably some anxiety in your heart about that. And you've probably got that concern dialed up just a little bit too high. And it may not always be obvious to you. And so it might be good for you to preach sermons 10 minutes shorter than you think you need to preach them, to preach texts a paragraph shorter than your inclination, and to make sure you're getting the sort of main point of the text right, as opposed to taking your commentary with you in the pulpit. And so just to dial it down a bit and to relax and realize it's the Lord's church. He's going to keep the people. He's going to use you to do that, but you'll be more effective if you're just patient and you're not trying to change things, but to love the people.
I'll just quickly add, because that was my experience. I came to the church in 2004. They had one pastor previous who had been there for 36 years, and wonderful evangelical man and foundation. But any two pastors are going to have differences and different personalities and ways of doing things. And so when I came, I told them I want to preach and pray and be with people. Those are my 3 P's. And it wasn't until years later, and I think I heard it from Mark Dever, say, well, there was a 4th P that I forgot, and that was patience. Because I went in and I saw stuff, and I remember thinking, 6 months, we'll get some of this taken care of. I remember talking to some of my other elders, and after 6 months, I think just we're on the next 6 months. We're gonna. Now I've been there 9 years. I'm like, we'll probably never get to that, but. So patience is huge. If you're just coming out of seminary and you really like seminary, you are apt to way overshoot your congregation. I remember I just felt so compelled. I was starting a sermon series on Ephesians. I just knew I didn't feel like I should, but then I felt like, man, I just gotta have a really good section here on the Pauline authorship of Ephesians. And and my congregation is very educated, but even they're looking at their Bibles and it says Paul to the Ephesians. And they're thinking, well, I'm guessing that was from Paul. I just felt like I gotta respond. I gotta fight these things. And so someone told me once, make your intellectual level for the high school senior. They said that intentionally. Somebody who's in the habit of studying, maybe, but in the habit of studying, thinking, reading, but yet, so can learn new things, but doesn't know all the vocabulary, doesn't know it. So I would just be very wary of overshooting the congregation, and then to be incredibly patient and love the people, just like you said.
And it's funny. I mean, this is where your heart's your own enemy, right? So I was given that counsel by one of my elders. You need to bring it down, aim at high school level, and I just thought that just sounds really condescending and offensive, and let's stretch to people, and it was doing too much. It was trying to do too much and trying to, in a single sermon, sort of raise the theological education of the congregation. I started with Ephesians. I wouldn't do that if I had to do it over again. Well, why? I'm going to a pretty typical evangelical church, gospel-believing church, that probably hasn't had a lot of teaching on Ephesians 1, all right? And some folks got lost right there around verse 5 or 6. So maybe start with a gospel and have the folks looking at Jesus in a really wonderful way.
And when you do that, this isn't the time to do your 10-year Roman series right out of the gate. People think, we got this guy, and this is the only thing he's ever going to do.
If ever he'll do 10.
Yeah, if ever. But, do a 6 or 8 week series or something. And then I would just say, work hard with your elders. You have, I mean, you can do all sorts of stuff in the congregation if your leadership structure is on board and you've built up a camaraderie, build-in retreats. I'm amazed that pastors try to lead their elders by just having a business meeting a month. You need, quote, wasted time with those men where you're just laughing and watching something, playing a game. That's not wasted. All of that is building the sort of relational collateral that you're going to need when you get the collateral damage.
It's a really good point. We're going to bring Alistair in here. Yeah, that's a mistake I made. You know.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Is it still Wednesday?
Excellent.
Let's get a pizza.
Never mind.
Alistair, we want to learn from you.
It's going to be good.
No, well, it must be. It's not mine. Ken Sandy, I learned something from him that he learned from a board member of his at Peacemaker Ministries, a little thing, RIT, relationships before issues, except where there's trust, right? And that's my way of summarizing what Kevin is saying. Look, go there and spend time just being a guy, being one of the guys, getting to know the guys, letting them get to know you, not putting those issues on the table. We're going to get them done in 6 months because you just don't have the trust there. You don't have that currency yet. And so that means you need to spend the time building into your guys, being built into by your guys, and building relationships.
So to summarize, yeah, this is all good stuff. The reason I was enjoying it so much is because I was enjoying it. I'm learning. You know, Boyce, I attribute to Boyce the statement, we overestimate what we can accomplish in a year and underestimate what we can accomplish in 5. So that's the issue to patience. The question of speaking so our people can understand is aptly illustrated in the story, or in a story of William Barclay, whose commentaries should be used with caution. Willie was a very, very clever New Testament scholar, Greek scholar, from Glasgow University. He went to his first church down the Clyde, down the River Clyde, and did very much what you're saying, you know, started straight off as a university professor. And he met one of the members of his congregation in the high street not long after he'd been there, a little lady who was out getting her messages. And she said to him, Dr. Barclay, you're an awfully nice man, and the people like you, but we can't understand a word you're saying. And Barclay went home and he said, okay. And that's when he then wrote the Plain Man's Guide to Prayer, the Plain Man's Guide to the Gospels. He actually determined to put it down on a lower shelf, which he did admirably. The trouble is he put some other stuff on the shelf, which wasn't so good. And in concurrence with that, I was just looking for a quote here from Luther, which I found. A preacher should have the skill to teach the unlearned simply, roundly, and plainly. For teaching is of more importance than exhorting. When I preach, I regard neither doctors nor magistrates, of whom I have above 40 in the congregation. I have all my eyes on the servant maids and the children. And if the learned men are not well pleased with what they hear, well, the door is open. And the only other thing I would add to that is that in the same, and in concurrence with what my brothers here are saying, it takes time before we can actually legitimately use certain language. So I know that my congregation is familiar with me referring to them as loved ones. I never ever wrote that in my notes. I never ever thought I should call them loved ones. I don't know the first day I ever did. But there's a sort of superficial familiarity that is represented in our social media. Like, could you like me on Facebook, you know? And so, no, I don't even know you, and if I did, I probably wouldn't like you in any case, but no, I'm not gonna like you, no. But so sometimes when we're young, we've heard older guys using language of endearment, a language of familiarity that is the language of a matured relationship. And I think what you were saying, brother, clearly is that until we have matured in those relationships, then we ought to temper our language accordingly.
All right, so as we think about doing the basic of evangelism well, a pastor writes, I'm a pastor who's around Christians all day long. What are some helpful ways that you've found to reach out to unbelievers in your community on a personal evangelism level?
I've been trying to grow this year in personal evangelism. And remember, I looked up probably a month into the year. I'd sort of set the goal of trying to have at least one evangelistic conversation a week, and looked up probably 5-6 weeks into the year, and I'd had 2 such conversations, which was great on one level, but sort of not hitting the mark. My rate has been slower since, which is to say that the sort of bubble we can live in, we have to sort of fight against actively. I would say don't miss the opportunity to do the work of evangelists in your preaching.
Right.
Right? Assume that there are people in the congregation who are not yet believers and do not yet understand the path of salvation. Explain that, preach that regularly. And then I would say try and develop the habit of just sort of look at your routine and see if you can't develop habits that take you outside that bubble. So I regularly go to the same restaurant for lunch. It's my second office. The entire wait staff, as far as I know, are non-Christians. Before I have my meals, I ask them, how can I pray for them? And I invite them to the special events of the church, and I try and work on getting gospel conversations going. So try and look at your routine and change your routine. Go to places where there are not Christians. My guess is there are probably also believers in your congregation who have spouses and children who aren't believers. Think about your visitation strategy with those families as an opportunity for evangelism. If you got ladies in the church whose husbands aren't believers, maybe they come every once in a while, reach out to them, strike up a friendship if you can, begin to do the work of evangelism with persons who are sort of closer to your orbit in that way, but aren't yet believers. Those are some thoughts.
I wish I were more faithful in prayer, and I'm even worse in personal evangelism. So I learned from these men, but so you pray for one opportunity a week. I'm less ambitious, like we're once a month. But he's faithful to give you those opportunities. I think for anyone here who's just saying, I don't even know where to start, that simple act to pray, Lord, give me opportunities. Please make it easy, because I'm a doofus and I will run the other way. Just opportunities to share the gospel. So I was in a cab in Chicago and wanted to sleep, and when I woke up we were still in traffic and got talking to this nice Pakistani Muslim, and we were able to talk about things and talk about the gospel. I also agree with Thabiti. I mean, some of my best or only, personal evangelism stories are from the places that I go to often, and you can tell what sort of person I am.
For pizza, right?
Bell's Pizza. I've meet people there. They all know me. When I was at seminary, I went to Harry's. See some Gordon Conwell guys here. Woo! And walked in there, and the guy he didn't know my first name. He said, "Large pepperoni." That was my name. I said, "Thank you." So I've been able to invite people to Christianity Explored from that. Shared my faith with a Muslim guy working at Krispy Kreme Donuts, so you just get a feel for where I go. and then as everyone probably knows, just to be a good neighbor and be that we have kids help tremendously if you have kids in the house. So our house right now is the one where all the little boys in the neighborhood are coming over to play soccer and play football, and we want that, even though they make a big stinking mess. And we've tried at times, we're gonna have a Christmas party. We're gonna have a neighborhood cookout. And it's not that we get them there and then we necessarily share the gospel, but to have a place in their lives to be friends. They all by that time, they know that I'm a pastor, and probably the ones that aren't Christians, who are most of them, are little nervous. I mean, my one neighbor said that they leave for the gym after we leave for church on Sunday morning because they don't want to feel bad. Like, you don't have to do that. So just trying to show that you're a real person and you can engage with them in other areas of life.
That's good.
All right. Another pastor asks, how do you address contemporary notions of sanctification that seem to lack references to the imperatives of Scripture and the pursuit of holiness?
That's, there's a hole in your holiness, right?
Yeah.
Take it away.
Well, there it is, the
Take
book.
it away. There it is.
The hole in our holiness. That's where I try to go at that. I mean, there are some gospel-loving saints who think they sniff legalism in every exhortation, and they're smelling the wrong thing. So I think what we need to understand is that Scripture provides many different medicines for our motivation. To rehearse our justification would be one glorious motivation or medicine. But Scripture also gives warnings, and Scripture gives promises, and Scripture tells us to think of our identity in Christ. And so as preachers, I guess, we want to be careful that we're not just preaching our thing that we think the text should be saying, because we're worried it might go off in another direction. But we're preaching what this text says, and not only what this text is, but what the mood of the text is. So some texts have a mood that ought to be very comforting, very pastoral. You don't preach the Lord is my shepherd and just kind of get up in people's face. Is the Lord your shepherd or what? I don't think you even know the shepherd. Well, that's not the mood. But then the other example I give is, 2 Samuel 11, David's sin with Bathsheba. The text ends, and the thing David had done displeased the Lord. There ought to be a note of gravity, and your sin is displeasing to the Lord. I mean, that's why I think that chapter is there. And if you end that message and every message with kind of pulling the punch, but we know that we all sin, and there's a greater David, and David's greater son, and it's Christ, and then and it's sort of, I was feeling like a little uncomfortable. Well, that's all true, good, biblical, redemptive, historical theology, but it's not getting the mood of that text, which is to be a warning, and other texts which are to be hortatory in their effect to stir us up to things. Our people need all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I just concur with that. These are younger men, but I may be picking up the signs wrongly, but I just detect a sort of incipient antinomianism that is running like a fairly virulent virus, if that's not tautology, running like a virus through many of the younger men, many of them have come out of a background of sort of pietism or formalism or legalism, and the pendulum has. They've entered into the wonderful discovery of the nature of justification, and yet the pendulum has swung way out on the other side. And it's alarming in that given the influence that they have on many young and impressionable people who haven't even come close to any reckoning with anything at all. So that basically the theme is, Jesus did everything. Jesus was really good. I'm really bad, but Jesus was really good. I was really bad again last night, but of course Jesus was really good. He's always good. Therefore, I guess I'll be bad again tonight. I'm planning on it. And but Jesus is really good, and so it's going to be okay. And in point of fact, what they need to be brought up against is many of the imperatives of the New Testament. That without holiness, no one will see the Lord.
That's right.
And these people who had the amazing experience of being set free from the bondage of Egypt died in the wilderness. So you don't end that sermon by going, but don't worry about it. You're supposed to worry about it.
Sometimes when we find the gospel hammer, the whole world looks like a legalistic nail.
Yeah.
And that's everything is just boom, boom, boom. and don't realize, well, it's a great hammer, and there's some different nails out there that require some different correction.
It's good.
All right, maybe time for one or two more. This question comes from a lay couple serving in a church at a lay capacity, and they would like to know how they deal with perhaps significant theological differences that they might have with the leadership of the church, how to affect change sort of from the ground up, or when it's time to actually make the decision to go to another church, how to wrestle through that. Your thoughts as pastors, sort of on the other end, how you would counsel them.
You either submit or you leave. The third alternative is not a good one. You stay and you cause conflict, right? So when you join a church, I think one of the most important things for you to discover is what that church believes. It's usually embodied in their statement of faith. And if the church has some kind of healthy membership practice, one of the things they're going to take you through is their statement of faith and ask you in some way for your support of it and endorsement of it. So that you need to think about that as a major part of your membership responsibility, to uphold the doctrine and the teaching of the church. And to do so in Hebrews 13 in a way that's submissive to the leadership. Now, that's not to say that persons don't grow and maybe come to some different theological commitments. And that's what perhaps raises the question of, can we continue to submit to this, or should we find another place where we can happily join and serve in unison with persons? That's not a bad outcome to leave it that way, particularly if it's on some cardinal point of doctrine, right, which was what should be summarized in the statement of faith. I mean, it's probably a warning sign if you go to a church and the statement of faith is inclusive of a lot of secondary or even unimportant sort of issues, dividing the body in the way that Christ hasn't. But if you've come to a different set of convictions, what I would want to counsel is that your first reaction be prayer. Your second reaction be to submissively approach your leadership and say, these are things I'm thinking through. And in fact, at the point that you begin to think through those things, you probably should be talking to your elders and asking, shepherd us through this set of questions that we have. Teach us, be teachable. And at the point that you begin to land at a set of convictions that are maybe different, but you find to be biblical, continue that dialogue with your elders. Make your main ministry to them, number 3, encouragement, rather than critique or complaint. And if it is that you have to leave because you don't find yourself like-minded, leave well. Leave well. Let them help you find the next church. Let them pose some questions to you that you should consider, both about your own soul and the next church as you make that transition. Make sure your relationships are intact in that church before you leave. So if there are people that you have offended, and the Lord has helped you to see that it's the offense not of truth but of your demeanor, character, go be reconciled to your brother. Fix those things. Don't take that baggage with you to the next church, and let the elders shepherd you through your theological journey and maybe shepherd you to another church. But broadly, there are really only 2 options: submitting to the leadership or deciding to exit. You want to rule out that third option of causing contention and splitting church, because the question about sort of from the ground up, I think that assumption is problematic. You haven't been ordained or called in that congregation to lead it theologically. And so that may in fact be a kind of usurping of the teaching authority of that church rather than a submitting to it. And so those are some quick thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's very wise. I think very rarely is the Lord calling somebody to start a grassroots movement to change the theological direction of their church. And even when it's bad, if David would not lay a hand on Saul, then surely we ought to be restrained as well. So I would just say with the Thabiti, you pray, you check your own heart, your own humility. You don't start, creating kind of a rival network, a church within a church to do it. After all of that prayer, you may present your concerns very humbly to the elders or to the pastor, and perhaps you suggest, here's a book that I've really found helpful. Maybe we could read it, or maybe you might consider reading it, or here's a conference I would love to take you to. I've just found it very helpful. And maybe if it's a younger man, he may still be forming and be open to that kind of shaping. But if you have a man who's been in the ministry for decades, it's highly unlikely that he's looking for new theological input or direction, even if he should be. And so I think very often in those cases, we ought to graciously and humbly, with some explanation, kindly leave and affiliate with a different church. Would you correct any of that, Alistair?
No, I wouldn't. I'm happy with those responses. I think they're very helpful.
Have you had, we've probably had people that try to correct, and I've appreciated the people that have just been humble and kind, and I've had conversations say, yep, that's not the direction that we're going to be going. And sometimes they stay and say, well, okay, I can live with it. And other times they leave and they, Lord bless you, and I hope you find a really good church.
Right. And often they come back.
And that's a good point. You want to, even as a pastor dealing with that, someone's coming to you in that way.
Right.
You want to deal with that gently and lovingly, leaving the door of return wide open.
Right.
And that's a good result.
Yeah.
I most often get this on baptism. People who come and don't understand baptism, they're sprinkling babies and stuff, and we have to sort of help them out.
Steady.
And that concludes our time.
Is that we're done?
That's it. Yeah, we're done.
Yeah.
Just a brief prayer.
Just no. You
Got it in just in time.
Yeah. So, yeah. Why don't you just give R.C. Sproul a call, eh? Yeah. Before we wrap it up, and we're going to sing a song, I think, aren't we? I just want to give you the opportunity to express your gratitude to both of these men. One goes for a plane, and the other goes for a car. So thank you, guys. Thank you. We're done. We'll go.